back into the Eastern Bloc, and ultimately unsuccessful attempts to bring Yugoslavia back into the Eastern Bloc, and essentially a kind of a thaw in relations with the rest of the bloc. Now there are limits, of course, to this thaw, as the Hungarians discovered. You could not challenge the hegemony of the Communist Party itself. If you did, there would be big problems. Now, from 1964, the leader was Leonid Brezhnev. And he was indeed, up until the early 1980s, until I think 1983. I've got it on a slide a little bit later on. Was the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, under Brezhnev, things began to stagnate a little bit. The economy was initially not doing very well. And you know, the Soviet Union sort of slipped, as well as the rest of the Eastern and Central European communist states, into a bit of a malaise, a bit of a funk. But Leonid Brezhnev did cultivate better relations with the West, a period of so-called détente, of sort of, looking back to things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the sort of the tense moments of the Cold War. Brezhnev was interested in cultivating better relations, a kind of live and let live system within the West. Now, the Soviet Union had its problems, particularly from the end of the 1970s onwards, so in the very last period, what would become the very last period of Brezhnev's rule. If we turn to slide number slide number 5, one of the biggest problems that the Soviet Union was facing from the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s onwards was a very deleterious conflict in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. Now, the conflict is a very complicated one, and one that I'm loath to go into in too much detail, because it is very complicated. But essentially, if you can see the map in your head, Afghanistan at that time was on the Soviet border, and was kind of considered a little bit like places like Kazakhstan or say even Ukraine today, to be the sort of, to be within the realm of interest of the Soviet Union today Russia. So Afghanistan was kind of the backyard of the Soviet Union, and there had been a sort of a communist-friendly government. They had been ousted, and they had asked for some assistance from the Soviet Union. And initially, the Soviet Union had sent in a very limited military mission, like an advisory mission, but they had simply got kind of bogged down in this conflict. Their military presence in Afghanistan was just getting bigger and bigger. The casualties were getting greater and greater, and the conflict was sort of morphing into something that in many cases the Soviet Union wasn't ready to deal with. It was essentially a sort of an insurgency led by so-called mujahideen, which are sort of Islamist fighters, who didn't have a huge amount of technology, although they did get some money from the CIA and from the Pakistani intelligence services, and they were able to sort of wage a conflict with the they're able to keep the Soviets out of the pretty much out of the entire country except for the bigger cities, so like the capital Kabul, for example. This is exactly why I didn't want to get into Afghanistan. Just like the Soviets, when you start getting there, you never get out. It's very complicated. But the bottom line is that Afghanistan was an extremely expensive conflict in terms of blood and treasure. Many young Soviet men and not so young Soviet men were going out into Afghanistan, and they were getting killed or they were getting maimed. It was costing a huge amount of money, and it was not clear how this conflict could be ended, or indeed what the exit strategy, or even what the goal was in this conflict. It's very often called the bear trap. So like the Russian bear getting caught in this conflict. Now, the various things, because of Afghanistan, various sort of changes and various things were happening in Moscow, in the Soviet Union. There was kind of a sense that foreign invasions of this kind were not advisable going forwards, and the war in Afghanistan got very serious kind of from the early 80s onwards. That's kind of 82, 83 is kind of the time that the Soviet presence became its largest, and it's sort of it's most complicated. So there was becoming a sense that this was a conflict that could not be won, and it wasn't exactly clear what the war aims were in any case, and how this could be dealt with. Now, if we turn to slide number 6, as this problem in Afghanistan was unfolding, there was also kind of a problem in the leadership of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev left office, died in fact in 1982, and he was replaced by the former head of the KGB, a man called Yuri Andropov. Andropov, incidentally, had been instrumental in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. He'd been one of the sort of masterminds behind this invasion. He was not a young man, as you can see. He was also in his 70s. He had been part of the Soviet pyramid. He'd been part of the Soviet system for a very long time, and he was kind of on his last legs when he became the general secretary. Very old, very worse for wear, a lot of late nights, a lot of vodka, and a lot of sort of, you can imagine that it takes its toll, rising up through the communist system in the years of Stalin, and even perhaps in the early years of Khrushchev. It's quite a hard time for these guys. So Andropov came into power and died also quite shortly thereafter in 1984. And he was replaced by a man called Konstantin Chernenko. And Chernenko was a real mummy, actually. He was completely, the guy was moribund when he rose, literally half dead. I'm not even exaggerating. There were... they had to stage false meetings where they, in his hospital bed, they sort of made up some, made it look like it was a meeting room, propped Chernenko up, got him to sign something, put the cameras on him, turned it off, and then Chernenko would simply collapse back into his sickbed, which indeed became his deathbed. And Chernenko was in power for about 11 months, and then he also died. Now, it was a very dark joke. We'll come to him in a moment. But the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time was, of course, Margaret Thatcher, and the U.S. President was Ronald Reagan. And when Andropov was inaugurated in Red Square, when he was announced to be the General Secretary, I think it was Thatcher said to Reagan, "Well, I missed it. I couldn't get to Moscow to sort of see this." And Reagan rather cheekily said, "Well, don't worry. You missed the inauguration, but you can go to the funeral." So this was about Chernenko. You can go to the funeral because it's surely not far off. And indeed, less than a year later, Chernenko was also gone. Chernenko died. Now, this was kind of symptomatic of a lack of new ideas and new thinking in the Kremlin. The way the Soviet pyramid functioned, it took a very long time to work your way up to the top. You had to be very conservative in your outlook, had to be kind of old school, communist. You had to be quite traditional in the way you thought about economics, the way you thought about politics. And Andropov and Chernenko were very much of that mold. Too old, too long in the tooth to come up with anything new. And as a result, this was the way they sort of looked and where they thought. Now, it looked very much like that if we come out of the Soviet Union briefly and look at Eastern Europe. It looked very much like that on the bloc as well. Some of these fine young old gentlemen we've already met, but we can quickly go around. If we look at the leaders of the communist states in Central and Eastern Europe, men like János Kádár, he had been in power since 1956. Nicolae Ceausescu, we'll talk about him in the next session. He had been in power since 1967. Erich Honecker of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, had been in power since 1971. Gustav Husak had come into power after the Prague Spring at the beginning of 1969. We could add, of course, Todor Zhivkov, who came in to power in Bulgaria in the 1950s. These were people also who were quite dilapidated. They had been in power for a very long time. They were not men who were ready or willing to offer much new in the way communist rule was organized, in the way the bloc was run. It's known as a gerontocracy, which is to say the leadership of very old people, and that's precisely what was going on. Now, a few things changed. If we come back to the Soviet Union, their relations with the West took a turn took a turn at the beginning of the 1980s. In the beginning of 1979, this is on slide number 8. There was a presidential election, and the winner of this was the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan. This is 79 or maybe 1980, I think, and then he was inaugurated maybe in 1981. Ronald Reagan came to power. Now, Reagan was, we can see in number 9, a former studio actor who had then become a politician, first a Democrat and then a Republican. This was back in the days before Arnold Schwarzenegger being governor of California, before Clint Eastwood, before being governor, before the current president, who of course also has a background in show business, doesn't he, and entertainment. So it's quite unusual at this time for someone who was not, had this very different background to come into power. But nevertheless, Ronald Reagan had once upon a time been an actor. His most famous roles were acting alongside a chimpanzee called Bonzo, and I put up a picture of Reagan and Bonzo for anyone who is interested in either of them. Now, Reagan was a very folksy. He was very good on camera. Having been an actor, very, in his way, quite charming, quite funny, if you're into this kind of thing. But he was also staunchly anti-communist, and his line against the Soviet Union was much more aggressive and much more assertive than his predecessor Jimmy Carter, for example, had been. So, in the period of Brezhnev, in the 1960s and particularly in the 1970s. This had been, as I say, the period of what was known as détente, a period of relatively good relations between the communist world, at least the Soviet Union, and the United States and the sort of the non-communist world. They weren't sort of pointing missiles at one another, or they were, but they weren't. They were reducing missiles. They were meeting in places like Helsinki in the middle of the 1970s. They were agreeing to sort of strategic arms reductions. They had relatively good relations. Ronald Reagan was very different. He came into power on a platform of anti-communism, and he would speak in very aggressive and very assertive terms about the Soviet Union, about the communist world, which for him was the great evil in international relations. Now you can see this in slide number 10. I've put a link to a YouTube clip wherein Ronald Reagan is giving a speech. And he talks in very clear terms, and again, very assertive and very aggressive terms about the contemporary face of evil. And, in this clip, you'll see he says, it's not, that evil today is wearing a suit, sitting behind a desk. He's a commissar, he's a general secretary, he's a leader of the communist regime. So we have new blood in the White House, an assertive, aggressive, and energetic anti-communist right-wing Republican president, whereas at least in the first half of the 1980s, on the one hand, you have the gerontocracy, you have Brezhnev, you have Andropov, you have Chernenko, old guard, very frail, moribund leaders, and then at the same time you have this enlarging crisis in Central Asia. You have this conflict in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union are getting caught up in and can't sort of find their way out of. So the Soviet Union, still a superpower, still a major force on the world stage, but starting to sort of have its difficulties, starting to have its problems, and this is becoming quite a serious issue. Now, things change. If we turn to slide number 11. Things change in 1985. The new first secretary, the new general secretary, of the Soviet Union, so the new leader of the Soviet Union, who replaces Chernenko, is quite different from his predecessors, a man called Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, many of you will have heard of this name before, generally, because I would mention him a lot. But anyway, he's a very important figure, perhaps one of the most important figures in Cold War politics. Gorbachev, and for someone my age and my generation, Gorbachev, of course, would be a household name. He would have been on the television in the 1980s perpetually. You know, he would have been a very vivid and a very sort of present figure. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and as I say, very different from the people who came before him. In the first place, he was much younger. He was in his mid-50s when he came to power. Now, that's not that young, I know, in the general scheme of things, but to rise to the top of the Soviet system and to be so sort of relatively youthful, was a big break from Brezhnev, a big break from Andropov, a big break from Chernenko. So in this sense, Gorbachev was quite different. That's one thing. In the second point, Gorbachev was temperamentally and politically also different from the men that had gone before. He was a man who understood and was ready and willing to talk and to act on this knowledge. That the Soviet Union was in more trouble than many people cared to admit. That they had this problem down in Afghanistan, that the economy of the country was not as strong as many outsiders believed it to be, that the bureaucracy was snarling very important things up, and that major changes needed to be made in the Soviet system. Now, it was incredibly difficult, of course. Just think about how big the Soviet Union is. It's all of Russia, it's all of Central Asia, much of Central Asia. It's the Baltics, it's the Caucasus, it's Eastern Europe, Belarus, Ukraine, and then it's our territory as well. It's Central and Eastern Europe, to a lesser extent, not part of the Soviet Union, but certainly, as I mentioned earlier, part of the Soviet world. So it's a colossus, far-reaching, and it's kind of a mainstay of Russian and then Soviet politics. It's one thing to sort of rule in Moscow, but wait out in places like Vladivostok or Siberia. Going right back to the Tsar's period, very often you read these memoirs of sort of late 19th century Russian imperial life, and the Tsar's power and the power of the Orthodox Church, which was a national church in Russia, an established church, often does not sort of extend into the vastnesses of mighty Russia. So it was a very difficult thing to do, and on top of that, even within the Kremlin, there was still a lot of conservative forces, still a lot of people who were opposed to any kind of changes and anything being done in the country. So Gorbachev had his work cut out, but nevertheless, he was a man of incredible intelligence, incredible energy, extremely so hardworking, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and somebody who wanted to sort of change the direction of the Soviet Union. In a strange way, he was quite similar to some of the figures that we've encountered before. People like Imre Nagy in Hungary in the middle of the 1950s, or Alexander Dubček in the 1960s. Like them, Gorbachev was a committed and loyal communist and member of the Communist Party, but at the same time somebody who believed that if changes and reforms were made, the communist system could be improved. The communist system could be altered, and a new, improved deal could be made. Now, something happened early on in Gorbachev's reign that really kind of shaped his thinking. A terrible tragedy in a part of what is now Ukraine, but at the time, of course, was part of the Soviet Union. This is in slide number 12, the Chernobyl disaster. I'm sure that many of you will have heard of this, and some of you may even have seen the tremendous HBO miniseries Chernobyl. If you haven't done, I strongly advise you to watch this. It's an incredible insight, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other historians, into what late Soviet society and late communist society looked like in the middle of the 1980s. Chernobyl, of course, was a nuclear accident, a nuclear disaster. A reactor exploded and caused huge amounts of sort of suffering and huge amounts of death. Now, the initial tragedy was exacerbated because of the way the Soviet system reacted and responded to it, which was one of incredible secrecy. They attempted to play down the disaster. They didn't tell the foreign press, but they also didn't tell people within the danger zone. And the danger zone, in fact, was very large because the nuclear fallout was considerable. They kept the lid on things. They weren't honest with the firemen, with the nuclear scientists, with the people who were going in to sort of deal with this problem. They behaved in typical sort of Soviet way: keep it quiet, try to contain the problem, try to keep people in the dark. And in fact, it was not until a meteorological center in Scandinavia, I think in Sweden, detected a massive rise in the level of radiation in the air because the winds were blowing it north and blowing it west, and sort of came out in the open and said, look, something is happening out there in the Soviet Union, which is extremely, something very serious has happened there, because we're recording levels of contamination which are 100 times higher than they would normally be. So if that's what we're getting, and we're in Scandinavia, what's going on over there must be thousands of times worse. And at this point, the Soviet Union did come clean and admit what had happened, and started to talk about this. Now, for the lesson of Chernobyl for Gorbachev was that the usual ways, if these reforms and if these transformations were going to happen, and if the Soviet Union was going to be improved and was going to be altered, the usual ways were not adequate. Chernobyl, in a sense, had shown that the secrecy, the arcana, the clandestine nature in which the Soviet Union handled its problems, covering up the information, trying to contain problems which simply could not be contained, was a kind of, it was kind of an example of all that was wrong, many of the things that were wrong in the Soviet Union, covering up of information, not being clear about what was happening, and in this way exacerbating problems. So, the reform program, the wide-ranging reform program that Gorbachev put into practice, put into action, was known by the Russian word for reconstruction, perestroika. But in order for perestroika to be successful, Gorbachev believed that it needed to be handled in an atmosphere of what he called openness, glasnost. So he looked back at what had happened at Chernobyl. He looked back at what had happened in the past of Soviet history, and he decided, that this needs to be, it needs to be done differently. It needs to be conversation. People need to be able to come out and have the confidence to talk without punishment, to talk about the problems in the economy, to talk about the problems in politics, to talk about the problems in the Communist Party, and that this needed to be a far-reaching discussion, openly, safely, within a safe space, in which people could be, Soviet citizens and Soviet people could discuss their problems. Now, what happened, of course, was a remarkable unleashing of Soviet brilliance and Russian and Soviet genius, if you like. That the latter part of the 1980s, the period of perestroika and the period of glasnost, were not only in a renaissance in political thinking and economic thinking, but they were also a great renaissance in cultural thinking. Books that had not been available in the past under Brezhnev and under others were now uncensored. Movies that people could not have watched previously were now back in circulation. In this very brief period, in the latter half of the 1980s, there's an incredible flowering of of many things in the Soviet Union, of sort of ideas, of literature, of art, of filmmaking. There are some great Soviet movies that come out in the latter part of the 1980s. My personal favorite is a movie called Little Vera. Little Vera, like the name, which is a movie about a young woman living in Russia who is sort of rebelling against her parents, rebelling against the old ways, and sort of trying to sort of have fun with her friends and get out of this sort of this trap that this social trap that she's in. I think you can find this film online, but it's very good, and it's I watched it again at the cinema actually here in Prague a few months ago, and it's really stood the test of time. In fact, it still looks great in my opinion. Okay, so that's Perestroika, that's Glasnost. Incidentally, the book, Gorbachev wrote a book called Perestroika, and it was translated and published in many millions of copies in English, and you can find that quite easily. It's like for like €2 on Amazon. It was such a mega publishing sensation that book is quite easily found. Okay, now what then does all this matter? What does this mean for Eastern Europe? It basically means a transformation in policy and a transformation in approach of the Soviet Union towards the Eastern Bloc. It's not apparent at first, but under Mikhail Gorbachev, the appetite and the desire to sort of keep the Soviet bloc, to keep the Eastern Bloc in place, subordinated to Moscow, subordinated to the Soviet Union, is basically evaporating. Now, it's not clear to begin with. There have been moments in the past, as we've seen, where an apparently reforming leader, like, for example, Nikita Khrushchev, has come into power, and the Hungarians, for example, have learned to their peril that the extent of reforms are not quite as far-reaching as they had initially hoped and initially believed. So, to begin with, at least, there is a certain amount of trepidation in the changes that are taking place. But nevertheless, the communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe are beginning to realize by the end of the 1980s that under Gorbachev, under Perestroika, their rule cannot go on in the same way that it's been going on elsewhere. In addition to the Perestroika, which is taking place in Moscow and in the Soviet Union, there are minor mini perestroikas taking place throughout the rest of the bloc. Or at the very least, the leadership in these countries needs to come to terms with the reform and the changes that are taking place in the Soviet Union. Perestroika is kind of presenting to them a challenge. It's saying, well, look, if the metropole, if the communist imperial center, Moscow, is starting to make these dramatic changes, are we going to do the same? What's going to happen here? And of course, you can imagine that in places like Poland, where large parts of this is, as we saw last week, large parts of civil society are mobilized, if not in outright opposition, then at least in a critical position towards the Communist Party and towards the regime, either through the Catholic Church or through the Solidarity Trades Union movement. They're asking themselves, okay, well, what's going to happen now? I mean, is our Polish leadership, are they also going to confront perestroika? Are there going to be reforms? Can we read censored books? Can we watch censored movies? Can we begin to talk seriously about the economy? Can we whisper it? Talk seriously about the role of the Communist Party in national life and political life. Similar things happening in throughout the bloc, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. The communist leaderships in all of these countries are confronted with this issue of perestroika, and they're also coming to the realization that if there is something drastic happening in their own backyards, if things are changing, they will not be at this time rescued by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will not prop up communist rule. Now, with that gone, it may just be as simple as all that. With the support of the Soviet Union gone, communist rule in Eastern and Central Europe was pretty short-lived. It begins in Poland, and again, it's for the reasons that we discussed last week. The Communist Party is in a very difficult position economically, that the Polish economy is not strong. There are large forces, mass forces, which are critical to communist rule, those being Solidarity, and again, as I say, the Polish Catholic Church. They have been cautious in the 1980s under martial law. Martial law ended in I think 1983 or 1984. But nevertheless, perestroika, Gorbachev, the changes that are taking place in the Soviet Union are giving those forces more confidence to sort of approach the communist regime, approach the Communist Party, and demand that they're treated as almost equals. Now, it begins, as I say, in Poland. In the spring of 1989, the Polish Communist Party also realized that it's not going to be possible to simply crush Solidarity, to impose martial law, to threaten violence, to threaten a Warsaw Pact invasion. Under Gorbachev, this is simply not going to happen. Incidentally, Gorbachev pulled out of Afghanistan in 1988, began to pull out, which was also a great turning point. It was clear to many people that this meant the end of Soviet military adventures abroad, in the near abroad. So what happened was the famous round table talks. You can see that in slide number 14. The Communist Party sat down on a big round table, which is why they're called the round table talks, with the leaders of Solidarity, and began to thrash out a negotiated political settlement and political future. Now, in the eyes of the Communist Party in Poland, they were not relinquishing power. They were just willing to sort of share parts of it with Solidarity, with the non-communist forces. And so what happened is essentially elections were called. This is in June 1989. It's in slide number 15. They weren't completely free. Only certain seats in certain parts of the lower house in the Polish parliament. The Polish parliament had two houses, a lower house and an upper house, like a senate. Certain parts of the lower house were opened up to non-communist candidates. And the upper house was kept only for the communists. You can only vote for them or not vote for anyone. And what happened in these elections was an incredible humiliation for the Polish Communist Party. Solidarity, which were now outright contesting as a political force, won pretty much every single seat they contested in the lower house. It was a landslide. They whitewashed the opposition. And meanwhile, in the Senate, which was contested only by communist candidates, there were further embarrassments because in most cases the Polish voters simply scratched no candidate. And I think all but 3 senators were booted out. So only 3 were returned to the Polish upper house. In June 1989. It was a rout. The first multi-party elections, as attenuated and as marginal as they were, had resulted in a terrible defeat for the Polish Communist Party, and it was a very clear indication of the way the winds were now blowing. The Polish Communist Party was not willing to forcibly keep power. They had not the support from the Soviet Union. There were grassroots movements which were opposed to them. This was the beginning, in a sense, of the end of the Polish Communist Party. Now, it was a domino effect that began to spread throughout the Eastern Bloc. Next on the list was Hungary, which had also become relatively liberal. A very relatively sort of perestroika-like movement was taking place in the middle and the late 1980s. In many cases, that the country was more liberal in its last days of communism than it is now under the current nationalist conservative government. In June, the big turning point in June 1989 was the reburial of Imre Nagy at the National Cemetery. This was a great sort of reawakening and a great rethinking of the communist past, of the history of the invasion, and a great sort of groundswell of protest against the communist regime. In slide number 17, the star of that reburial was a young student leader, a man called Viktor Orban, who was one of the leading members, one of the leading figures of the student movement Fidesz. And Viktor Orban stood up and gave an extremely effective and extremely passionate speech about the Communist Party, protesting it, talking about the new direction that the state should be taking. It was one of the most electrifying moments of what would become the anti-communist revolution in Hungary. Now, of course, Viktor Orban is today, and has been since 2010, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And Viktor Orban has changed political direction quite dramatically since his student days. If he was a liberalizing Democrat at the end of the 1980s, he has now become, in his own words, a liberal, an authoritarian leader, somebody who is taking Hungary in a very different direction. So it was like this around the bloc. Of course, the most iconic scenes, if we turn to slide number 18, was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, Berlin had been a divided city since the beginning of the 1960s. The wall essentially opened up at the end of 1989, and that this is this provided the international media, the international news media, with the most iconic images of this incredibly sort of revolutionary year. Moving now on to slide number 19. This is the so-called Velvet Revolution on the main square, Wenceslas Square in Prague. Václav Havel would go on, the playwright and the dissident, whom we met a few sessions ago, would go on to become the first democratically elected president, non-communist president in Czechoslovakia. There he is on stage with Alexander Dubček, who was still around, but was by this stage very old, and in many senses, a figure of the past. Okay, finally, what do we learn from all of this? What were the revolutions like? And incidentally, if you want more detail, have a look at Crampton. He goes into these in considerable depth. And gives a very good sort of outline of what happened. Well, what was the pattern? The revolutions in almost all cases were largely non-violent. There was some skirmishing, there was some confusion. There are hints that maybe Erich Honecker, the East German communist leader, was willing to use the police, to use the army to try to quell what was happening, the protests and what was happening in East Germany. That never came to be. So there was not the kind of violence that was seen over the summer in China, in Tiananmen Square. These were grassroots movements. These were popular movements coming from the bottom up. But at the same time, part of their success rested on the willingness of the communist leadership to meet them in these kinds of round tables to discuss a negotiated way forward. And in some cases, like the Polish case, the communist leadership didn't realize actually that this would be the end of the communist communist rule, but nevertheless it was. So an unwillingness a willingness to talk to, to talk to the democratic forces, to talk to the anti-communist forces that were taking hold throughout the countries. 1989, of course, essentially differed from 1956 and from 1968, insofar as there was not a Soviet intervention, and with all of the other things that were going on, it may be that ultimately this was the most important distinction between 1989 and those previous preceding moments of reform and challenges to the Soviet system and to the Soviet bloc. Without the threat of Soviet intervention, with Mikhail Gorbachev in power, it was simply, not going to be. There was simply not going to be, there wasn't going to be the kind of scenes that we had seen in Prague in 1968 or in Budapest in 1956. So, thank you.